The US is going to turn the whole world into people prepared to die for their nations. All they can do now is turn themselves into bombs. Taha Yassin Ramadan, Saddam Hussein's former vice president.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. Tonight we are asking the following question. What drives suicide bombers to make the ultimate price? We are posing this question to Robert Fisk, Tahsin Al-Shekhli, and Yoram Schweitzer. Yoram Schweitzer, from a Palestinian point of view, desperate, occupation for over 60 years, they say, we have nothing to lose. This life is not worth even living. That's why we go through the route of suicide bombings. As an Israeli, as an expert on security, do you find justification in that?
Not at all. And I'll tell you, let's stick to the facts. If we look at the Palestinian suicide bombings campaign, some suicide bombing campaigns, there were two periods. One was 93 to 2000, when the Oslo Accords were on the march. And those who wanted to defy and to confront Arafat's decision to go in the political path, they were the one who used this instrument in order to block the process, the avenue that the Palestinian has at least had a chance to fulfill. And they used suicide bombings in order to defy both Arafat and Israel. In the second period, which was much more aggressive, much more harsher, when there were over 150 suicide bombings that succeeded for the Palestinians, then the Fatah and others joined in. Let me say something about Iraq. From all the figures that Mr. Fisk gave us, if you count the majority of the casualties, these are Iraqi people, Iraqi soldiers, Iraqi policemen, Iraqi civilians, innocent civilians. Those are the ones who were killed under the slogan of anti-occupation. Indeed, there were operations against the occupying forces of the United States and its allies. We can use the word occupation as much as we like, but I think the Iraqi scenery just shows us that the occupation was put aside into other considerations and ambitions.
Let me take a comment from Tahsin Al-Shekhli before I see Robert Fisk is shifting in his seat. Go ahead, Tahsin.
I think I absolutely agree with Mr. Shomer from Tel Aviv. Really, it's a new culture here in Iraq. The Iraqi society doesn't accept that the people kill themselves as suicide just because they have something to express about. It's a new culture for Iraq. Now, most of the people that suicide themselves or killing themselves through such kind of accidents, we measure them, most of them, they are not Iraqis. But if there is Iraqis, they are even suppressed really, and maybe his sons being killed through the attack, through some attacks, or his father or his wife or his family being killed or something like this. Such kind of people being a simple target for the people that encouraging those people to do such kind of things, killing themselves.
I think that most of the Iraqi suicide bombers are Iraqis. I can only find 5 out of what 1,121 suicide bombers who actually have an identity, and 3 of them are Iraqis. I mean, let's be frank about this. You know, there are 200,000 foreign fighters in Iraq, and most of them, as we know, are wearing American uniforms. This thing about foreign Iraqi, many people who live in Jordan believe they're the same people as the people who live in Iraq, because it is we, the Western powers, that drew the borders of, you know, Palestine, Iraq, Transjordan, and so on after the First World War. What we've got to look at is a situation where there is great injustice in the Middle East. Much of it the creation of the West. Whether we include Israel in this or not is not the point at the moment. And as long as people feel this injustice and suffer from this injustice, there will be a continuation of the horror of suicide bombing. We've got to get away from the idea of, do we solve this with, you know, do we solve this with a new wall or extra troops or a surge or a non-surge, and start to say, what can we do to end the idea of suicide bombing, because it's not normal.
Indeed it isn't. Yoram Schweitzer, in your first response to my question, you mentioned something about an incentive, perhaps even a foreign incentive. I don't know whether that was a direct reference to the payment scheme that Saddam Hussein established for the families of suicide bombers in Palestine, especially from Jihad al-Islami and Hamas, whenever they went on a suicide bombings and they left with no money whatsoever, Saddam used to pay about 10,000, sometimes 20,000 to the families. Was that something you referred to?
Look, first of all, I didn't refer to, but look, I would say that the Palestinians, whether it was Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad at the first phase, and in the second phase, them and others, they had their own motivations. They had their own personal motivations, they had their own organizational, which are much more important.
There is a motivation, and that is to put an end to Israeli occupation. That is exactly what drives them.
Yes, I don't, look, again, as I told you, the first period, around 7 years, it was against the general consent of the Palestinian population, most of it, that didn't support violence against Israel because they had hopes, most of them, according to the polls.
Do you agree with that, Robert Fisk? There is the Palestinians that were
coming on here. I'm speaking to you from Dublin. And the reason I'm saying that is that here in 1916, a very small group of people, only a few hundred fighters, staged a rebellion against British rule, which the whole Irish population, including the Catholics of this city, Dublin, were totally against. And the cruelty with which my people, the British, dealt with those Irish rebels by shooting them, put the whole of the Irish people in Dublin and in Ireland on the side of the rebels, and within 1916, 6 years, 1922, this country became an independent republic because of the treatment of the people who had risen against occupation. That is a lesson which, you know, many Israelis learn about because they're fascinated by Michael Collins, the Easter Rising, etc. You don't seem to have taken it on board, but because I'm in Dublin, I have to make that point to you, Yoram.
Let him answer, see if the Israelis are reading the lesson loud and clear.
I don't want to get into this path because we are deviating from the issue, and I don't mind. I think that, for example...
We are not. Yoram Schweitzer, we are not. We are going to the very heart of the issue, and that is what legitimate questions, what legitimate weapon some people who are desperate and dispossessed they have to take.
We can play with the figures. I don't ignore that Palestinians were angry. But if you look at the facts, and regardless of what happened in Dublin, and we know the history, the Palestinians had a chance, at least according to the majority of the Israelis and the majority of the Palestinians in the first period, to have a road, a path towards some kind of modus vivendi. There were people that were against it and used this tool. In the second phase, they were desperate and didn't see any hope. Then others joined. I think it just sharpened the understanding that at least in the first period, it was aborted by those who exhorted to violence instead of political solution. Now, political solution is the only solution from both sides to the issues between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Tahsin Al-Shekhli, last question to you, and that is the very essence of this suicide bombings is to create terror in order to drive the occupiers. Without a morality, without judging it, without justification. The question is, did suicide bombing contribute to a certain extent, to a certain degree, to the American decision to say, we are out of here?
No, I don't think they affected the decision of the American decision about this. You know, Mr. Jassim and your guests, remember, if we review the films that for the demonstrations of Saddam Hussein regime soldiers, demonstrations in Baghdad streets at that time, where there are some people wearing the white clothes and written on their chests, they are suicide soldiers. From that point, it's a matter of Islam or of the extremist Islamist parties that encourage the people to killing themselves in such kind of accidents. No, also the doctorate establish such kind of culture, make some people believe if they are doing such kind of thing, they will make a difference.
Thank you, Tahsin Al-Shekhli. Robert Fisk, what is the difference between Mission Impossible when in the West, if you remember, perhaps during Second World War II, let us remember the eldest brother of John F. Kennedy went on a suicide, not a suicide, but on Mission Impossible, knowing full well that he was going to be killed. Is there a comparison between the two, or there is completely different analogy?
Might be killed, not would be, but might be. Let's just keep this factually correct. Look, if you go around the great battlefields of the First World War, in which my father, who was much older than my mother, was himself a soldier, you'll see gravestones which say they gave their lives. But did they know every British soldier who fought in the First World War wanted to live, but feared very much that he would die? The difference is that the people we're talking about in this programme today want to die and do not want to live. And until we grasp that basic fact, we're not going to deal with how we can end this great tragedy. Tragedy primarily for the innocents, but also for the families who have, incredibly, to say, my son is a hero because he killed X number of children or women or innocents, which is the most grotesque part of our story and our narrative, which we're discussing today.
Yoram Schweitzer, close the program for me with a 30 seconds final comment.
Look, as I told you, I strongly believe that the political track is the only one that can solve this issue, but when you are confronted with such a massive suicide bombing, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Afghanistan, when you have more than 300 suicide bombings per year, whether it's in Pakistan in 150 suicide bombings, you have to confront it, because each time you intercept a suicide bombing, you vote for peace, you have a chance to resume the political negotiation.
Yoram Schweitzer, Tahsin Al-Shekhli, Robert Fisk, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq. To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until then, have a great week.